I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. New Hampshire. That's the latest state on the precipice of adopting a comprehensive privacy law. On this podcast, we keep you updated on all of the breaking laws to answer the key questions that all of our clients want to know. Is the new law different than the many other state laws that have recently been adopted? If I comply with California, Colorado, and other states, do I need to do anything different for New Hampshire? To discuss, I've invited Harsimar Dhanoa on my team to provide a quick overview on what's in the bill and, importantly, what's not there. You may remember Harsimar from past episodes, including our recent pod, where we discussed the new New Jersey privacy law, which will now go into effect in January 2025. Harsimar, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Scott.
Terrific. Well, Harsimar, why don't we start? Maybe you can just give us a quick overview of the new New Hampshire privacy law. And I guess it's not a law yet, it's still a bill, but it's now been passed by both houses in the legislature and soon will be going to the governor's office.
That's right, Scott. So I think when most businesses hear that there's another state, there's oftentimes groans of, another one. But luckily, I have good news here in that most of the requirements, if not all of them, under New Hampshire's bill are requirements that we've seen under other state laws. You have things like the traditional consumer rights for access, correction, deletion, also those opt-outs that are becoming really quite common with respect to targeted advertising, sales, and profiling. So this is sort of another state that's added to that patchwork of very similar but slightly different laws.
So, Harsimar, that's interesting. I mean, I'm interested first. Let's talk about what's similar. What are those key kind of tenets and themes that we have seen from other laws that now also appear in New Hampshire?
Yeah, so one of the unique things about New Hampshire itself is that the bill is very closely inspired by Connecticut's privacy law. And that's what Connecticut had originally passed before the recent amendments to add in consumer health data related provisions. So for the most part, if you were to hold these two side by side, you'd see that there is, outside of maybe one or two spots, it's near a copy and paste. I think the idea there was, here's a standard that both industry and advocates, were able to come together on. Here's a nearby state that's handled this. So why don't we take a very similar approach?
Interesting. So if that looks very similar on most of those laws, and obviously Connecticut has been a law that companies have been planning around for at least for the past several months, how is the law in New Hampshire different? You noted that there were a few places where there may be differences.
Yeah, so the first one that comes to mind is the fact that New Hampshire uses lower applicability thresholds than what we've seen in other states. Traditionally, most states use around 100,000 as the minimum number, but New Hampshire actually cuts that down to around 35,000. This isn't too unexpected given the size of the state, but it's one of those areas where if you've sort of gone state by state and said, listen, we don't have to worry about this given the scope of our operations, it may be one that you want to just double check on to make sure that nothing's changed there.
Okay. So, but it sounds like all of the other kind of key tenets of restrictions on selling of data and ability of opting out and the areas around updating privacy notices and individual rights, all of those are the same standards that we have seen in the past and now are also applicable in New Hampshire.
That's right, Scott. The only area I wanted to call out specifically is that New Hampshire also gives a sort of pseudo rulemaking ability in two discrete areas. The Secretary of State is allowed to set standards for both privacy policies generally, as well as to set sort of the mechanisms that businesses need to use when allowing individuals to submit rights requests.
So that's interesting, Harsimar. I mean, I think, that rulemaking authority is an important point because that also then gives these states more ability to modify over time instead of having to go and actually have a new law be adopted at the legislative level. I think we've seen now 3 states that contemplate rulemaking authority: Colorado, California, and soon to be New Jersey. And it sounds like for New Hampshire, there is some levels of rulemaking authority, but not as comprehensive as some of those other states.
That's right, Scott. It's really targeted here, focusing just on those rights submittal mechanisms and the privacy policies. That said, even though it's really targeted, there's still a lot of variety in what the Secretary of State can do with that authority. If you take privacy policies in particular, it could be something as small as saying, hey, you need to have a minimum size font to make sure that everyone's able to read your privacy policy. Or it could be something a lot more formal and say, the content requirements are the same, but here's a specific table or format that we want you to use when you're presenting that to users.
So kind of some form or oriented issues, but you also said something important in that sounds like this rulemaking authority is not given to the Attorney General in the state of New Hampshire. It's actually given to the Secretary of State. Does that contemplate that the Secretary of State will have more of a position, at least in New Hampshire, with respect to privacy matters?
I think that's right. In this case, it may be that they're splitting up enforcement versus policy setting, in which case, we may see the AG work hand in hand with the Secretary of State to try to refine those pieces, and over time end up working hand in hand.
Okay. Importantly, I think other question that a lot of our clients want to know, is there a private right of action?
Thankfully, no.
All right. Well, that will be great news, I think, for many. But Harsimar, I really appreciate your giving us the quick update on New Hampshire. And we will be on the lookout for the implementing regs from the Secretary of State. And to the Secretary of State of New Hampshire, welcome to privacy. With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.